Hey, Missing listeners. We are playing an episode that we recently aired on Missing here today on Crawlspace, and it is part 3 of our conversations with John Wesley Anderson about the JonBenét Ramsey murder. And he wrote a great book called Lou and JonBenét, and he also worked on the new docuseries from Netflix and Joe Berlinger called Cold Case, Who Killed JonBenét Ramsey. So definitely a timely and interesting conversation, and just want to invite you to go check out Missing and subscribe over there. Some of these Crawlspace episodes we're actually airing on Missing first, so if you want to hear them before they run on Crawlspace, check them out on Missing. And make sure to stay tuned for final thoughts after the interview with John Wesley Anderson. Thanks a lot for listening, everybody. Cue the Missing music. Welcome back to Missing. I am Tim here today with Lance. Lance, how are you today?
I'm doing fantastic today, Tim. I got to say, the guest that we have on is such an amazing human being, such a genuine human being, but every time he comes on, it means that there's been a development in the story that he's presenting to us, and I think we say this right off the bat in this conversation with him, that this story is one of the most notorious crimes in American history. I would say in the top 3 of my lifetime. But Tim, I need to know how you're doing today. I know it was weak, but I'm still so moved by the conversation we just had.
Yes, I'm doing great. Thanks for asking. And I think John Wesley Anderson is one of our favorite guests. He is a former sheriff, a former homicide detective, and he's now an author. And he's written this book called Lou and JonBenét, a legendary lawman's quest to solve a child beauty queen's murder. And the book came out last year in 2023. We had 2 interviews with him around the time of the book's release. We recently re-aired those episodes because of the new Netflix documentary, Cold Case, Who Killed JonBenét Ramsey by Joe Berlinger and his team. And the docuseries sort of follows along with this book and how it describes the intruder theory in JonBenét's case, and sort of additionally tries to take the focus off of the Ramsey family, John, Patsy, Burke, and John Andrew, and everyone associated with that family. And that is not easy work to do. And it's kind of hard to describe unless you've seen this out there or had conversations out there. But when this happened, when JonBenét was murdered in Boulder, Colorado in 1996, in her family's home, and of course she was 6 years old, the main theory that was sort of floated out there by the Boulder Police was that the Ramsey family did this, even though there was no evidence that they did. And so many years later, there's been a lot of media on the case. There's been a lot of books written about it. A lot of people who had heard that theory never moved off of that. And I don't know why exactly that is. If that's just sort of a first impression thing, or maybe, some folks haven't looked into it too deep. But what this book, Lou and JonBenét, does is look into it extremely deep. And John Anderson was friends with Detective Lou Smit and received his files in order to put this book together. And that is why we love this book. And so John Wesley Anderson is back here for a 3rd conversation. This is the beginning of December 2024, right after the docuseries came out on Netflix.
Yeah, well said about all of that. And I just want to add that there is a fundraiser through GoFundMe that we did not bring up in this conversation, but John wanted us to mention. And of course, we're going to support this. It is a GoFundMe, JonBenét, Lou Smit's Family Searches for Justice. So it's the investigative team that is still working independently without any compensation on JonBenét's murder. So if you go to GoFundMe, you can just search JonBenét Lou Smit, and that'll come up. And anything that you can give, all of that goes to paying for investigative services and also for testing any sort of evidence or any material that they deem is relevant to test. So that's very important. And also, if you do get the book Lou and JonBenét that you're holding up, Tim, if you do order that book from any bookseller, you can still go to Amazon and Google and Goodreads and Barnes & Noble, anywhere you can review a book. Give it a review, a positive one would be nice, because that bumps up the visibility of the book. And John has said he's not doing that because he's making a ton of money off of this book. He's doing that because of the information in the book that is Lou Smit's final report, so to speak, on this murder. And there's a lot of important information in there.
Yeah, I mean, in some ways, John is haunted by his friend Lou, Lou's ghost, who is pushing this book and this theory, and it's taken a long time to work. And arguably, it hasn't worked, but I think the tide is turning.
Yes.
And, definitely let us know what you think in the comments. Please tweet about this, forward this interview out. We know the YouTube comments have really been very active in the re-airing of these episodes. I hope the same is true for this third part here.
Yes. And you said a couple of things right there that I think are going to be further elaborated on in our final thoughts at the end of this episode, which is something that we so enjoy doing, and I cannot wait to contribute to it after this episode. So stay tuned at the very end of this episode for our final thoughts on this conversation.
Okay, and make sure to follow us on social media at MissingCSM. We're going to break quick for commercial here, and we'll be right back with author John Wesley Anderson. John Wesley Anderson, welcome back to the podcast. How are you today?
I'm great, Tim, and thank you and Lance for having me back. I've really been looking forward to the show.
Yeah, we've been looking forward to having you back because that means that there's news that might be relevant or kind of breaking, but you, I guess we can consider an old friend of the show now. This is your third appearance. You wrote an amazing book on probably one of the most notorious crimes in American history, but for anybody who needs a refresher on who you are, can you let the audience know?
Well, I'm thrilled to be back on the show. For those of you that don't have my background, I was a career law enforcement officer for 30 years and 22 years for the Colorado Springs Police Department, retired there as a sergeant when I became elected sheriff for El Paso County, Colorado. And while I was with the police department, I worked homicide for 6 years with Lou Smit, who's the main point of the book, Lou and JonBenét. And so I had a distinguished law enforcement career, had a chance to go into the corporate world, worked 10 years with Lockheed Martin Corporation afterwards, and then took an early retirement so I could focus on writing. That had been a passion of mine since I was a little boy, and I had several books that I needed to publish that just had to come out and get on print. And Lou Smit was picked up to be part of the JonBenét Ramsey task force with the DA's office in Boulder. And I didn't realize there'd be another book there. And that kind of came about a few years after Lou had passed away. So we'll talk about that more here in a moment. That's kind of a thumbnail sketch of my background.
Great. Well, yeah, welcome back to the podcast. You wrote this incredible book, Lou and JonBenét, and it's about your friend, Detective Lou Smit, and this case, and Lou, specifically, and obviously JonBenét, are back in the news, because of the new Netflix docuseries called Cold Case: Who Killed JonBenét Ramsey. And I just wanted to get your take on this docuseries from Netflix.
Well, we're thrilled to have the docuseries out finally. It was about a year in the making. That was something that was on my mind when I wrote the book, and I formatted the book in 3 parts, 3 acts per part. So I was hoping, a producer or a director or somebody would pick up on that, hey, this could be a good documentary. And the whole premise of the book is to keep the story alive, to keep the case from going cold. And the 2 main premises is that the Ramsey family were not involved in the murder of JonBenét. And then secondarily is that this case can still be solved with the DNA that was left at the crime scene. And I think the producer and the executive director did a really good job conveying both of those points. Of course, I'm a little objective, or not as objective as a lot of people, but I think they did a great job with those 2 points.
And in the scope of, Hollywood and the reality of your work, how did these two worlds come together? How did they reach out to you, and what was your feelings when you were initially approached?
That was really a good question, Lance, because I had never been down this road. This was my 8th book, but I'd never been involved with helping produce or advise on a documentary, although I had appeared on several, and the case had come up over several times. So this was all a new learning experience, and I was contacted, but gosh, it's probably about 18 months ago by a scout with a Radical Media team. They were the ones who ended up producing it. And he asked me if I still owned the book rights and if I'd be interested in helping support a docuseries. They were focused on a 3-part one from the very beginning. And I said I'd be delighted to. And so there's communications that go back and forth, and non-disclosure agreements and contracts that are signed, just to make sure everybody's on the same page. And that was a learning experience too. And then we started the scout, the people I worked with originally with their legal team. They handed me off to the executive producer, who we had weekly Zoom meetings every Friday morning. We'd have a Zoom call so we could tag up on what they did the last week, what they're focusing on, who they're going to be interviewing, what are the key things. And they were very open to ideas and suggestions. They didn't take everything that I was offering, but that's fine too. There's a lot of different ways to tell the story. And so we finished it up just about a year ago, got it in the can, got all the raw footage, and then the editing began. And that was very intensive. I was not as involved with the editing. And then it originally tried to produce just a 3-minute trailer, so that could be picked up by Hulu or Netflix or whoever. And in one of the Zoom calls, so the producer said, "Well, we're not going to do the 3-minute trailer anymore." And I said, "Oh, geez, that's too bad. Why?" And he kind of smiled. He said, "We sold the script. Netflix bought it, so we don't even need to do the trailer. We're fully budgeted. We're going right into production." And so that was really kind of an exciting benchmark, in the process. And then they were originally trying to get it out in spring of 24, and I don't know what happened. It got kicked down the road. Might be for ratings, I don't know, but it came to the fall. And timing wise, I think it was very well timed, because as you guys know, in following the case for so many years, around the anniversary date, December 26th, every year, there's more interest on the case. And so the timing, I think, coming out, right before the holidays was served us really well. There's a lot of buzz, a lot of excitement, and I think finally some momentum being built within the Boulder Police Department to do something.
Yes. Okay. Yeah. So that's my my next question here is, how is the official investigation changing because of this?
Well, we definitely know that the new police chief who started there watched the docuseries and made some comments about it. He filmed a media release and a written release that they're doing everything they can. They're open to receiving leads, following the DNA evidence. And they were just a little bit more transparent than they have been in the past. And although our team's not met with them in a couple of years, we only had 2 successful meetings, one with the DA that the police department came to, and then later one at the police department that the DA came to. But then the head of the case, Commander Trujillo, cut off all communication with the Smit family team. So that was really, really difficult. So we continued to work, the case on our own, but we were kind of a little bit in the dark. We weren't real sure, how much information they had, if we were crossing paths with them. And that's one of the reasons why I wrote the book. When I wrote the book was to get everything documented. And I was a little concerned that maybe even within the police department and the DA's office, because they've had a change of leadership. This is like the fourth police chief and like the third or the fourth district attorney since when this case happened in '96. And I wondered, well, how much information do they really have on their own case? And I know that sounds unbelievable, but we do know the last time the Smit family team met with Boulder PD, the commander in charge of the investigation was proud of the fact that they've never put the investigation on their intranet, and it's locked in a closet. And he has one of the only 2 keys. And we laughed later and said, well, this case isn't going anywhere. What kind of an attitude is that? And when they refused to talk to us anymore, we were really disappointed. So I think this new leadership team that's in place with fresh eyes and maybe fresh information that they didn't have access before, because as you guys know, when you read the book, Lou's intruder theory is very clear, and that's one of the things the producer did well with the Netflix documentary. I think he presented a very objective, clear-eyed was his quote, look at the case, the facts of the case, the physical evidence, which led to the intruder theory. And I think he said this on one of the interviews, Joe Behringer, that when he started this, he was a little embarrassed that, he'd kind of bought into the Ramseys did it theory. And probably, I don't know at what point, but, during the production, he turned around and he said, well, listen, what we've been told is not true. And the more he learned about Lou and Lou's work, and he did get some unprecedented access to Lou's archives, investigative files, the video clips that you guys saw in the docuseries. That was something Lou did about 3 years before he came down with terminal cancer and ended up in hospice. And so he spent all day, 8 hours, videotaping himself with his son-in-law in his basement and going through the slides and the case and the evidence and how he saw that. And I think that was really unique because, rather than me trying to explain, well, Lou saw this is a stun gun and this is why, and here's the photos, you actually get to hear and see him and hear him talk about it. So I think the documentary did a really wonderful job capturing those essential details and getting firsthand information, not just from Lou, but from other people that were involved in the case.
You said something a couple of minutes ago that Tim and I both had the same reaction to, and I just need you to maybe expand on that a little bit. What did you say about they didn't have it on their own intraweb or their intranet, and they needed to they had it literally locked up?
Correct. Yeah. They most police departments, they have an intranet. People can access website. Like when I was the sheriff, you on the outside could, log into our jail system to see if somebody's in custody, what was the charge, what's the bond. So there's an external, portal. But internally, we keep that digital information very close hold because we might be getting an arrest warrant or a search warrant or whatever, dealing with confidential informants. So that internal intranet is something that we protect and we share information. So you can access it, remotely, or, if you're in the department or if you're out in a patrol car and you're trying to, look up information on a weapon, a firearm. But in this case, not only had it not been digitally scanned, but it was all in paperwork and files that were in cardboard boxes locked in a closet, a janitor's closet, with only 2 keys. So, yeah, that was really appalling to us too when we heard that. And the commander who was telling us this took great pride, that I've got one of the only 2 keys. We do know now that the case has been fully digitized. That was one of the comments that came out in the one of the Boulder Police releases. And so there's more access to it. It looks like there's fresh eyes, investigators on it, commanders, supervisors. So we think the case is really getting a lot more attention. And what we hope is that, if you're a detective assigned to the case or supervisor, how can you not, want to look at the docuseries? How can you not want to, keep track of the physical evidence and then compare that, what's in the actual case file?
Yeah, absolutely. And I know there was a lot of talk in the docuseries about the DNA, and that seems to be still a very prevalent sort of avenue of investigation. What can you tell us about the DNA that was found at the scene?
Well, just as a refresher, the DNA came from 3 sources. our sources, 3 places. On JonBenét's left fingernail clippings and right fingernail clippings at the autopsy on the 27th of December 96. This protocol, you always take fingernail clippings or scrapings. And so from that sample, they were able to extract DNA, only it wasn't a full, complete, genetic markup. It was only, I can't remember the number, 5 or 6 or 7. And then on her underwear, her panties, there was also another source of biological material that was tested. Now, her DNA is commingled with some of this, but you can extract her DNA, and it left us some additional genetic markers that we had within 3 weeks of the murder. And I shared with you guys before the program a DNA report, 2-page, that came from the Colorado Bureau of Investigation. There's a couple of important things, and you're welcome to post that on your website if you want to. But that lab report at the top, you'll see that it's dated December 30th, 1996. It lists samples of DNA that they've collected from various people and names every member of the Ramsey family, to include the ones that weren't even home at the time, John Andrew, who was off at college, and others. But anyway, you can see the names of the people that they drew DNA from. Within 4 days of the murder, you'll also find it interesting at the top. There's a series of codes, for the offense, the standard reports, the law enforcement agency, and then suspects. And you'll see that both Patsy Ramsey and John Ramsey were named as suspects 4 days after the murder by the Boulder Police on that evidence report when it was submitted. Now, if you turn the report over to the back page, you'll see on January 15th of 97, the lab report comes back to them from the Colorado Bureau of Investigation that excludes all samples that were submitted. So it excluded all members of the Ramsey family. And that report was not made public. And in fact, that report has an interesting history, and we don't know all of it. What we do know is that about 7 months later, Lou Smit, who's an investigator at the district attorney's office on the task force, he's receiving supplemental information from the police on the case, and he's tracking that. He date stamps it, and he indexes it. And when he gets this report from CBI that's 7 months old, he goes, "Holy cow! This is huge," because it excludes the Ramsey family. And he questions, well, why are we still considering them, under the umbrella of suspicion? That was the catchphrase the Boulder and media were using. And he said, there's clear evidence that that excludes them. And then in 2008, the long johns that JonBenét was wearing, a newer method of DNA extraction called touch or trace DNA was used. And below the waistband, there was another source of DNA that was identified. That is not a full set of genetic markers, but it is consistent enough with what is on the panties as well as under the fingernails. So we do have 3 sources of compatible DNA, and it was sufficient that when you add the markers together, they're male, so it excludes everyone who's female. There's a high probability that it's Caucasian. There's some exceptions possibly to that, but it gave us the minimal threshold at the time to be entered into CODIS, the combined DNA information system that the FBI tracks. So we've been told that her DNA has been in CODIS for several years, which is huge because that, begins to search, prison populations and convicted sex offenders and eliminates a lot of potential persons of interest. And that has never been identified, but we do know that it's foreign to anybody in the scene. It's nobody that's been searched yet. It's an unknown male DNA, but the location that it's found is hugely important. So we think that there's some advanced technologies that can be applied. Some of that DNA is commingled, some commingled with her. There's a possibility of a second unknown male that could be in there too. So the technology continues to evolve with DNA analysis. every year it gets better and better. The other thing that is really exciting is every year, the public DNA databases get larger, 23andMe or whatever. And so there's more people from all over the world. And as you guys well know, you don't have to have the suspect in hand. If you can get through the familial DNA into his family tree, and then you can track him, to who's out there, you can start eliminating people until you get down to the one. Then you get a good sample from him. And that's exactly how they caught the Golden State Killer.
All right, we're going to take a quick break for commercial. And just a reminder, folks, that we will return at the end of this conversation with some final thoughts.
Thanks to our sponsors, and now we're back to the program.
To go back a little bit on this report that you had forwarded to us about an hour before we got on this conversation, is the DNA report, and it says, and this is just me not knowing how to read something like this. At the very top, it says suspects.
Right.
Ramsey, Patsy, Ramsey, John. Is the determination that they are suspects from something previous or from this report? Because it then says later on that they're excluded. But then later on, it says that the DNA profiles, I don't know if I'm going to pronounce this correctly, from the epithelial fractions from the exhibits, et cetera, were consistent with John B. Ramsey or a mixture of John B. Ramsey and Patricia Ramsey.
Right. Mm-hmm.
Can you just explain that to me?
Yeah, well, I don't have the report in front of me. Was that in reference to the pubic hair, or was it another sample that was there?
It was in reference to the samples labeled 23A and 23B, which were semen stains from black blanket. I guess my question is, they're listed as suspects at the top.
Right.
Is it because of this report?
No.
Which also excludes, but then in another sentence says that they're consistent with.
Yeah. No. This report was generated on December 30th. The analysis came back on the 15th of January, 2 weeks later. So they were named as a suspect before any of the analysis.
Okay.
And again, just to clarify that, the blanket is found in the Ramsey home. And, I think it's not uncommon, to find, seminal fluid or, body fluids or whatever, on a blanket, so you kind of, take it from there on your own. But what we do know is it doesn't give us anything that helps us identify or unknown male whose DNA is underneath the fingernails or on her panties. So there is DNA left at the crime scene on her body as well as on her clothing. And that's the unknown male DNA. The identified male DNA with John and the commingled with Patsy is unrelated to the murder.
That goes a long way in explaining why certain documents aren't released to the public and why certain documents have sections that are redacted, because if you give a quick glance on that like I did, it looks like it's saying there was this black blanket that was used to clean up bodily fluids, and then you just make that association that this had something to do with the murder itself. But like you said, this is a blanket that was found in the home. Yeah,
and that CBI report was something that was in Lou's investigative file when he had a copy of that, digital copy, when he left the Boulder DA's office task force. And then he had that in his investigative case notes until he passed away. And then all of his computers and files and everything he had been working on was passed down through his estate to his 4 children. And that's how I got access, was through Lou's family as being part of the Smit family team. And one of the things I had to struggle with, and I think when I was on your show last, Tim, I think the reason I may not have sent that to you guys was I listed in my book and talk about the DNA and spend quite a bit of time, but I don't think I had made the decision to release that document and until afterwards. And that's why this morning, Lance, when I was thinking, did I give this to you guys or not? I thought, well, I'll go ahead and send it to you. And if you say, oh, yeah, we got this, it's no big deal. But it is kind of a big deal. And how that came about, I had that, or Lou had it, and then our team had it. And I wrestled with the ethics of me releasing this. to the public, making it a public document, because this isn't my case. And, the other law enforcement agencies, both Boulder PD and the DA, they could be rightly upset with me for revealing information in my book, but particularly releasing an official document. And I wouldn't blame them for being upset. And I really wrestled with, being a retired law enforcement officer, is this ethically the right thing to do? I ended up deciding if I didn't do anything, that would be unethical. If I had physical evidence, information on this case that excludes this family, then it would be immoral, not only just law enforcement unethical, but immoral for me to sit on that information. So I consciously made the decision to release that about a year ago, and ended up releasing it on Fox News. It went around the world. It was picked up in the UK and other places. And but I think when you read the document and you see that, it causes you to question, well, how come this wasn't released by the police? Why wasn't this given to the Ramsey family? Why wasn't this told? And it makes you wonder, where was that document for that 7 months? And had Lou Smit not been there and took that, among all these other documents with him, thousands of pages of documents, where would we be today? Because I think it's that important. I think it's that groundbreaking. I wondered if that got shown to the grand jury or not, and I was hoping that would come up in the documentary, when they were talking to the grand jury special prosecutors, Michael Caine and Mitch Morrissey. And I don't remember, anybody showing that to them, saying, did you see this? And how can you go forward, with a grand jury and indict the parents who, on December 30th, they're named as suspects, but on January 15th, just 2 weeks later, they're exonerated through the DNA. And it's just baffling to me. So I think what I'm really thankful of with the Netflix documentary and the book and everybody that's helped support that is I think we're seeing some of the facts come out in kind of a new light. And people are saying, well, that's not consistent with what we heard. And if it's within the law enforcement community in the Boulder area, hopefully they're taking all of this, into consideration as they look through their persons of interest. And Lou left behind a long list of persons of interest.
Very good. Yeah, I would love to talk about some of those, because I know the docuseries goes over a few notable ones. Yeah, would you mind telling us a little bit about some of these folks like John Mark Carr and Gary Olivo?
Yeah, these guys were really well known through the media and all. I think that's one of the things that the docuseries does well is there's been 6 or 8 guys that keep coming up over and over again, and for good reason. They either confessed or there was evidence that drew them to the attention of the police. One of my criticisms or inputs was I think we're giving too much time, to these guys. Let's not give them too much, because part of the reason people confess to crimes they didn't do is for their, 15 minutes of fame. So I said, if we got to show them, let's get it down to, 90 seconds. Let's just do short little things. And I don't know, did that part go on too long in your guys' opinion on the other people who've been ruled out?
Yeah, I understand why you'd say that, because they did spend maybe like half of the 3rd episode on a few of those persons of interest, and obviously no guarantee any of them have anything to do with the case. But I have to say it was pretty informative, and I'm glad that they did cover it, because it gave me some more information, and I think ultimately a lot of people want to know about those folks.
You're absolutely right, Tim. And that is one of the good things that they did by going into that much detail, because when and if there is an arrest and we go to court, all of those guys would be perfect straw men, for, public defender, defense attorney. Say, oh, well, how about this guy Gigax? He had, 1, 2, 3, and could lay out the evidence. And that would certainly cause, some reasonable doubt. But I think what the documentary does when they, go into kind of a deep dive on each of those guys, John Mark Carr, perfect example, is his DNA was compared, and it is not what was left at the crime scene. Although he was, you can see why, people were interested with him and Michael Tracy, just the way, he presented, kind of inside knowledge of the case. I think that was really worthwhile doing, just to eliminate the possibility of that coming up at a future trial. So on the same hand, I think one of the things that they did do well is there was kind of an interesting, one of the things I talked about with them during the production was I think it'd be interesting kind of a then and now. If you talk to the people that were really involved at the beginning and then go back now and see where are they. This in many cases had been kind of the high water mark of their careers, whether they were, prosecutors, part of the grand jury, prosecution team, or detectives. Where are they now? What are they doing? And you can kind of start to see a pattern there. With those people, did they have a continuation with their career in law enforcement, or did it come to an end and they went into some unrelated, business? Did they go write a book, and how did that part of their lives end? So I think that was kind of an interesting thing too, that was really well done.
Yeah, agreed. And also just going back to the suspects, I think it's important, but it's unfortunate because you ultimately and inevitably have to bring in the names of other people when you need to explain that there are other suspects. But did you think that was important to show or to just create some more space from the Ramseys?
I hadn't thought about it from that perspective, Lance, about creating more space. But I think what I was looking at was so many people that you would talk to would think, I think it was the brother, Burke. And then when you tell them, well, did you know his handwriting was compared and ruled out? Did you know that his DNA was compared and he was ruled out? When people start hearing that physical evidence, and it was baffling to me anyway, when people talked about thinking it was him. He was 9 years old, and how sexually advanced is he going to be? And when people, start hearing details of the crime and the way it was committed, she clearly was tortured and violently sexually assaulted in the way that happened. I think a lot of people start realizing, well, I didn't know all of the facts. And, when this comes out, with Burke, I think it's interesting too, and I heard this directly from a senior person with Boulder PD. Burke Ramsey is the only person that the Boulder PD officially ruled out of the suspect list, but that information hasn't gotten out there. And so I think that's one of the things this documentary does do, is it helps eliminate the Ramsey family without any reasonable doubt. There'll always be someone who says, oh, I think it was a cover up and whatever, because of whatever their theory is. And a lot of people will continue that up until the time, that an arrest is made and a conviction. And then, they'll, back off and, oh, well, yeah, I kind of thought it might have been the mom, but, now I think it's not. I think from an evidentiary point of view, docuseries does a really good job there, laying that foundation.
I agree. It is wild to hear the theories or see the theories about Burke, knowing he was 9 years old at the time. I have a child who's 9 years old. Like, it is so unfathomable that someone that age could do that to anybody, let alone their sister that they've been living with. But in the interview that they showed with Burke in the docuseries, he was 2 years older, and I imagine considerably bigger. Those are some serious growing years for a young boy. So I don't know how far that video had ever gotten out previously, but I just wanted to make that note that he was definitely smaller when JonBenét was murdered than where he is in that interview video.
Yeah, very, very, very good point. Yeah, I don't know what he weighed, but when you look at that, for the photos of JonBenét on her bike that she'd gotten for Christmas and Burke standing over his shoulder, that was such a perfect Christmas morning for him, and they're so happy, and not a mark on JonBenét. And I can't remember her weight. I think she was 6. I'm guessing she was like 45 pounds. He might have been 20 pounds stronger, or bigger, certainly stronger, but he wasn't an aggressive kid. I mean, these two played well together. He was her big brother. He loved that his sister, and they had always played well together. And when somebody suggests, he poked her in the face with that train track because he got mad over, some stupid thing. It's like, well, that's never happened before. And again, when you look at that pattern, where were they then? Where are they now? Burke is a decent young man, and he's a functional adult. This has been traumatic, no doubt. Any of us who went through this would have a hard time. I got a question for you, Tim. Being a father, one of the things I wrestled with in my book, and the producer made the decision to do this, but in JonBenét's autopsy report, you may have seen the photo of the skull cap that they had laid out that had the 8-inch depressed skull fracture. Do you remember seeing that in the docuseries?
Yeah.
I wrestled with, again, ethics, being a dad and the author of the book. Is that probative for me to put in my book? And I chose not to. I had that photo, and I thought it might be sensationalizing. I had an argument with another author who said, John, you're making a terrible mistake. It's got to be in there. People will never believe if you're just describing, that it's an 8-inch, skull fracture, the right side of the skull, and it's a depressed skull fracture. That won't carry near the weight as if you show the picture. And I understand exactly what he's talking about. But as a dad, would you be offended if this was your child and someone put that on the video? Do you think it's worth is it worth the risk? Is there a benefit, a return on investment for doing that?
Gosh, that's disturbing to think about. But I guess it's there's a reason for it, right? Mm-hmm. To put it out there, it's helping the Ramsey family and the case potentially. But with that said, I can totally see why you were hesitant to put it in your book. There's several parts that about this murder that are just so disturbing and almost hard to wrap your head around. And especially when you see some of those pictures, like the Garrett that choked JonBenét. It's even hard to say some of these words. It is so disturbing. Like how indented that was.
Yeah, that was clearly a torture weapon. He could have hit her over the head first. I do think when you see that in the docuseries, when you see that level of injury, and someone's trying to say, no, Patsy just got upset and in a fit of rage over a bedwetting incident, banged her head against the bathtub. You think, holy cow, that's not even at all possible. This is a depressed skull fracture. It had to take substantial force. Lou believed that it may have been inflicted with the aluminum baseball bat that I mentioned in the book that's in the backyard, and there's a fiber from the carpet that came from the basement attached to the bat. And other people speculate, and I think this was in the documentary, that maybe it was that mag light that might have been used. But I carried a mag light with multi-cell, 3 or 5 cells, aluminum mag light for years when I was on the police department, and I'm not so sure you could deliver that sufficient force. So I think Lou may have identified one of the 2 murder weapons. She certainly 2 causes of death: strangulation from the garrote, as well as the blunt force trauma with a depressed skull fracture, which is also very unusual to have 2 causes of death. Normally, in most cases, you have 1. So I think one of the fascinating things that comes out, is when you eliminate the Ramsey family and you look at the list of evidence and you start eliminating, what was brought into the crime scene, what was left behind. Well, one of the most alarming things that's left at the crime scene is the ransom note. And you have to say, well, geez, you have an unknown male, and if the Ramseys are not involved, and Patsy took polygraphs, John took polygraphs, if you eliminate the family, how much more clear could it be that the motive was this 2.5-page demand for ransom to return your daughter?
All right, we're going to take a quick break for commercial. And just a reminder, folks, that we will return at the end of this conversation with some final thoughts.
Thanks to our sponsors, and now we're back to the program. And it is you and Lou's belief that the ransom note was written before the intruder took JonBenét from her bed. Do I have that right?
Yeah, that was Lou's conclusion, that while the Ramseys were away from the home attending the dinner Christmas night, that's when the suspect or suspects, he always left the door open to maybe be more than one, when they entered the home through the basement, that they sat and wrote that note, 2.5-page note. And when you read the note, it's not past tense. We killed your daughter. Your daughter is alive. She's safe, or whatever. Don't know how much stock you can put into that. But Lou believed that the note was definitely written prior to her being abducted from her bed. And I think he was right with that.
Yeah, that seems to make more sense, as you noted, the tenses. But also, it does seem like he did intend to take her, and or even if that's not what you believe, it does seem like something changed during his act, because if he did sneak in and was waiting there, there was sort of signs of panic later.
Yeah, you're absolutely right, Tim. Clearly this guy had a behavioral. He was a sexual offender who made this plan for a kidnap for ransom. He wasn't a kidnapper and then decided he's going to do this. It's the other way around. So Lou always believed that something happened in the basement. Either he couldn't get her out the window, she started fighting or screaming, and that's when it changed. Maybe his intent all along was the sexual assault, but that's when he took her to the wine cellar, the boiler room, where the sexual assault and the murder. Lou thought she was killed in the boiler room, and then her body was moved into that wine cellar behind that closed door. Tim, or Lance, I got to drag you into this debate because I still wrestle with this. On the skull cap, you saw that too, and it is a shocking image when you see that from the autopsy. Do you think I should have included that in my book? Do you think the producer should not have included that in the docuseries? Lance, what's your opinion?
Yeah, it's such a delicate balance, right? To include something that's so graphic, to really drive home how brutal something was. I hate to say it, but I'm glad that they included it in the documentary. I totally understand why you didn't want to include it, because I think Tim said before, there's so many other horrific things about this that are included anyway. There's really no need to pile on. But I think when it comes to the documentary, and again, it wouldn't have offended me if you had included it in your book, because I would have seen the purpose of doing so, because you've already set up your book as something that is responsibly told, written, and not salacious to begin with. So it would be out of character for you to just throw this thing in just to shock value. And the same thing with the documentary. I think it's effective for something like that to be in this documentary so that it can further show just how brutal this murder was. And again, take the eyeballs off of individuals who never were violent before this, have never been violent since this. How could they just have a momentary snap insanity and just lose it so viciously and then go back to being not violent? So I think for that reason, I support that image. I support that being in the documentary, because it says more than just look at how brutal this was. We should all feel bad. It should really go a little further than that.
That's really a well-reasoned response, and you knew I wasn't going to throw you under the bus there, but I was really curious to hear, because I know you follow this case so closely too. It might be something interesting for your viewers or your listeners, to wrestle with, because sometimes, it's easy to criticize somebody else until you've been there. And in fairness, I may have been overly cautious that I didn't come across as being self-serving, especially as a technical advisor on the documentary, that I'm not just out here to sell books or, sensationalize this. I wanted it to be, if anything, a little more guarded than that, because I wasn't just protecting my good name or being worried about civil actions against me or my publisher. I'm really interested in preserving the legacy of Lou Smit, and again, having worked personally with him for 30 years and seen dozens and dozens of his investigative reports, and I talked to other friends about this too. When you look at Lou's reports, particularly his spreadsheet that has 883 entries, 53 columns, and you can find little notes where he mentions, Santa Claus or the candy canes or, the housekeeper or something. This truly was Lou's finest work. It was his finest hour. It was his opus. And what he left behind, if there is ever a person identified and arrested, convicted, it's directly attributable to the commitment of one man, Lou Smit.
Wow, yeah, very well said. And you too, I would add, because the work you've done, sort of carrying his torch, is remarkable and very admirable.
Thank you, Tim. That's very kind. But I have to keep going back that I'm just one person that's part of this team, the Smit family team. All of his children, grandchildren now, they're involved. So it's 3 generations of the Smit family, and other homicide detectives who have come and got involved. And Dave Spencer, he was one of our homicide partners, one of Lou's closest friends. The book is dedicated to Lou and Dave Spencer. And Dave worked the case, right up until the time he went into hospice about 4 years ago. And in fact, he passed away on JonBenét's anniversary, December 26th of 2020 is when Dave Spencer passed away. And the last conversation I had with him was outside of Lou. He was probably my next closest friend. It was the same conversation I had with Lou, and Dave turned over his investigative notes to me that he had kept for years. And he said, this needs to go back, to the team. And don't forget this guy, and don't forget this guy, and keep working this. So, I wrote the book partly because I just I'm turning 71 next month, and I'm writing other books. And I keep laughing, telling the friends or family that, I'll learn something new. The book I'm working on now is about dinosaurs, which I've always been fascinated with, completely unrelated to true crime. And I'm having a ball. And I've been working on it for about 1.5 years. And I love that. But I'll learn 2 new things about dinosaurs, and 3 things about the case fall out the other side. So the further you get away from the case, and the more interference you have with other technical things, the harder it is to keep a grasp of all that. But I also knew there was a reality, that, after Lou passed away, Dave passed away, it's kind of like, well, geez, you might be the last man standing. You better get, this down in paper. And Lou was very careful, of, protecting the integrity of the investigation. Dave was too. And that was the other thing I wrestled with. Is this, the right thing to do, to write this book? And it's not a tell-all, but it's tell a lot. It's getting a lot of information out there that's really not usually shared. And again, the law enforcement agency, Boulder PD, the original agency, or the DA's office, they have every right, to be upset with me. And I'll just have to own that, that if they don't like what I've done and think it's unethical, well, okay. But when you look at the alternative, and I keep going back to that report that I sent you, how many people in the Boulder DA or the police department knew about that? Nobody in the DA's office did until Lou got it, 7 months after the murder. I'm sure he told, Alex Hunter, but, how many other people realized the gravity of that report, the DNA exonerating, the family. And Lou knew that DNA is what's going to solve this case. And that was something that really came out in the documentary and the follow-on interview with the producer, Joe Beringer, did, with John Ramsey after it came out. He has a really good understanding of the DNA and what can be done with it. And hopefully we'll see some progress there.
Now you got me thinking about the inclusion of the image of the skull in the documentary, and I'm wondering if, in your opinion, does that do anything for the individual who is responsible for that if they were to see that in the documentary? Does that make them feel a bit of remorse or a little like self-disgust or anything? Is that a tool that can be used?
What a really good question, Lance. And I don't know the answer definitively, but I have been involved in over 100 murder cases, very violent cases. This is one of the most violent cases I've ever been involved with. Sexual assaults or particularly murders are particularly difficult. Then complicate that with it being a child victim. But most murderers, particularly serial killers, the very top of the pinnacle of violent, evil men, and you can throw some women in there, but most of the killers I've arrested or been involved with were men. And many of them, if not all, have this narcissist attitude, that, laws don't pertain to me. Most criminals think, well, I'm never going to get caught. I can do whatever I want. Tragically, in this case, this guy hasn't been caught. And so I think he can continue doing what he's been doing, without worrying about that. So I think, if you were dealing with a rational person like you or Tim, you'd probably say, oh, yeah, I didn't mean to do that, whatever. But this guy did. This was a coup de grace. That blow, Lou thought, and I think he's right, meant, to kill her, the sexual assault, the strangulation, the torture that had happened. And before he left, he knew he had to make sure that she was dead. And that's what that blow was for. So I don't think he would ever show any remorse. The remorse would be, I got caught, darn it, or whatever the right word would be that I can't use. But yeah, it's more, narcissists are more about me. It's all about me. I, not about, I sold your car and you can't get to work. Well, that's, too bad. I needed your car and it belongs to me now.
Now, you mentioned you've worked on or been a part of almost or around 100 murder investigations. Have you ever seen anything like this that involved a home invasion and the investigation? It just kind of goes in several different directions like this.
Well, most home invasions, are drug related or whatever. I've only been involved in one kidnap for ransom. And that was a young child and her mother. They were both abducted. And the ransom demand was, I can't remember what it was, but it wasn't $118,000. It wasn't a specific amount. It was, give me $1 million, you'll never see your kids again. And fortunately, these things don't happen a lot, at least in my experience in the communities, where I lived or worked. But is extremely rare is the garrote. Again, I've been involved in 100 cases, and I've talked to detectives like Lou, who was involved in over 200 cases, and we had never seen a garrote before. That's a highly unusual device. You could lock me in a room for a long time, and I could never fashion that garrote like it was. And whoever did that, they didn't just dream that up during the crime. They were in contact with JonBenét's, some of her hair was embedded in the knot, so he's in contact with her while he's fashioning the garrote for purpose, not to kill, but to control, for the asphyxial strangulation, to cut off the blood flow and bring her near death, loosen it, allow her to come back. It's a torture device the way he's using it. But to be able to fashion that in situ with that paintbrush, that middle part of the handle, to break off the bristled end, fashion that, probably in low light conditions. I don't know if he had a light on or not, but it's not in good condition. So he didn't bring that into the crime scene. He made that there. And then he took the tip with him. That's never been found. And then when you think of, the wood splinters that were found in the vaginal area, then, I think that tip of that paintbrush becomes even more critical from a modus operandi perspective. But back to the person who did this, they had to have practiced this. They had to have researched this. Same way with the slip knots. They used paracord 550, which at the time was not real common. It's more common now with outdoor enthusiasts. At the time, it was more, a military. And people it was used originally for suspension lines on parachutes. So people who were in special forces or, Green Berets or SEALs, they knew how to fashion a garrote. They were trained how to take out a sentry, coming up from behind. And certainly they'd know knot tying, and they would carry, some cordage or find it or use it, but they wouldn't carry, something that's non-essential that you can find in place, like, the handle that you can fashion from something that you're going to be able to, lay your hands on, wherever you're at. And so that took someone with some exceptional training and skill that they had developed before. The paracord, it wasn't that she was just tied up. Her hands were tied up in slip knots. So the more she struggled, the tighter they became. And then Lou was on to something really important about sequencing of events. He showed how the paracord, on one end of it was melted and the other end was frayed. I don't know if you guys work, with paracord much, but, the opposite end will fray. And that's why you put a little match or something under it, to melt that, because part of it's nylon, so it holds it in place. But the two ends of the cordage that's tied around the wrist, both ends are frayed. So he talked to me about that a lot. And he said, this shows me that this cordage came off of one long a spool or continuous piece that was cut, and that the garrote was fashioned first in the basement, because you've got the handle right there, so it was fashioned there. And then after that, the wrists were tied because it's frayed on both ends, and that showed plan, design, intent, means, motive, opportunity. He had brought those items in there, and he did not have. He didn't leave the roll of cordage behind. He took that with him. Same way with the duct tape. There was about a 6-8 inch strip of black duct tape on her face over her mouth when her dad found her in the basement, and he ripped that off. But there's not a roll of duct tape anywhere in the house. So somebody had to bring in a roll of duct tape, tear that off when they applied it, and then they took that with them. Same way with the stun gun, that was used. The Ramseys didn't own a stun gun. They didn't even know anybody who had a stun gun. And Boulder Police, last time I talked to them, they told me, no, Smit's absolutely wrong. That's not a stun gun. You said, well, what is it? Well, I don't know. Maybe she laid on a button or something, on the floor and it left an imprint. I said, that's just nonsense. And I said, when you look at a close-up, the slides, and I think the documentary did a good job with that, you see this little blue line, with electrical arc, went between the two probes. And I said, the distance of there that, Lou pointed out was, 3.5 centimeters. Well, that's the same with what's on her face. And then when you look at the air taser stun gun that was on the market in 96, he said that's the distance between those probes when you take the top of it off that shoots the probes and you're using it as a direct contact weapon. And I think Lou nailed that. And after you listen to it, you think, well, yeah, he was right. But other people, especially in Boulder DA's office, that no, I think Smith's wrong with that. Well, okay, then what's your alternative theory? Well, when you don't have one, that gives the other theory a little credibility. But what do you guys think about the stun gun? Were you convinced?
I just want to ask a question about the garrote again. The choice to use that when somebody could have just used their hands. If the intent wasn't to murder her with the garrote, just to strangle her to the point and cut oxygen off to the point of, passing out or near death, why wouldn't they just be using their hands?
Yeah. If you're just going to strangle somebody and kill them, you probably would just use your hands.
Or even if you were intending to just barely, bring them right to the brink of death, what does that say?
Yeah, I don't have a good answer for that, Lance. My only guess might be that they needed to be hands-free for something else. Or hands-free. Yeah.
Yeah.
For something. Yeah. So, that's a good question. But I think it does show that if it was the heat of the moment, and you're overcome with something, anger or whatever, you might manually strangle somebody. but it takes much more thought, planning, design, to use a weapon, especially if you're introducing something that's foreign to the scene. The cordage. If you're just picking up the bat that was there in that room and striking her over the head, that could be impulsive or whatever. But if you're bringing that bat into the scene and then you're taking it out, if in fact that's what was used, then that's showing more, of this plan, means, motive, opportunity.
Yeah, I think just one part of this case is just it's so hard to answer questions like that because we're not the crazy person,
Right.
like it's so
Right.
it's so
Yeah.
hard to put your head in to sort of rationalize like, oh, why did they try to write a few ransom notes before they decided on the one that they did write? It's like, well, I don't know. I don't have an answer for that.
Yeah, and I can tell you, Tim, you don't want to spend a lot of time, dwelling on those questions because it can take you to a dark place, and that's something I realized in writing the book. I've been involved in a lot of autopsies and things, and forgive me, guys, but adults your age, hey, you live at least this much of a life, and you made decisions in a lot of cases. Some were bad decisions that led you to the end of your life, for whatever reason. Not that there's any justification for killing someone else, but if it's a child involved, especially a 6-year-old, she didn't do anything. She made no decisions to get here. She's one of the most innocent victims you could possibly have. And so for me as an author, reading the autopsy report, reading the interviews, reading the police reports, deciding which photos are going to be included, which ones are not, and trying to get in the mind of the killer like Lou had done. If it were me and I came into the basement through that window well and I went upstairs in her bedroom and I, stun gunned her, where would I stun gun her first? If I sexually assaulted her, if I created, this garrote, how would I do that? Yeah, and the sexual components that follow. Those are not healthy discussions. And it's one of the reasons after I finished this book, I decided to do something completely unrelated and go back to another passion I had and was fascinated with and learning more about dinosaurs. So it's been a great escape for me. So it's really tough. And I'm sure the people who have been involved in the case, probably the Netflix people, who produced this, that team, this was probably really difficult for them too, because they're not, trained, police professionals. I know many of them did other, true crime or crime related documentaries where you're meeting, some really bad people and portraying, some really bad situations. But this has got to be one of the worst of the worst. So at some point you got to get, a mental break away from that and not let it really drag you down into that.
Well, dinosaurs might not be too close to the true crime genre that we typically approach on this show, but you're more than welcome to come back to discuss that book when it's been published.
And one final question here, John. In your opinion, is there an arrest coming sometime soon?
I don't know. I don't know how much of what we're hearing now is wishful thinking or if there's something that percolated out there. I know our team have given Boulder PD, everybody, everything we've got. We keep sending it to them. We don't want to be sitting on something that might solve this case. So we've probably really have been a bother to them, and given them too much information. Our top 20 list, when we eliminate a person of interest, we have another confidential list that we shared with them. The people at the DNA labs, we've given them the name, email address, phone number of the contacts we have that we encourage them to, to follow or contact. And so we've tried to give everything we possibly could to help further the investigation. So hopefully what we're hearing now is maybe a commitment of leadership, to do something with this. I think the documentary did put pressure, on the chief and the department, and people asking, well, why aren't you doing something with this? Whoever those people are, is it the mayor? Is it, the governor? I don't know. We tried to put pressure on the Boulder PD through the governor's office a year and a half ago. You guys may remember that. through an online petition that we were trying to force, the DNA evidence to be released, even not to us, maybe just go to a third party lab or somebody. And that didn't go anywhere. So I think the strength of the facts of the case coming out in the documentary has really been enlightening to the community, maybe to the department, and people are realizing, we really didn't give this case our very best effort, and that really needs to be done.
Okay, we're back here for final thoughts after the conversation with John Wesley Anderson. And again, just a great conversation. He's definitely one of our favorite guests.
At the beginning of the conversation, before we started recording, he let us know that he had knee surgery. He hadn't taken his medication because he wanted to make sure that what he was saying was going to be clear and well-spoken, and he really delivered on that point. And we went over an hour with him, and then we talked a little bit after. So I hope that he is now properly medicated and his knee pain is subsiding, and we do appreciate him going out of his way to talk to us today when he's in the middle of this surgery recovery. So thank you, John, for that.
Yes, absolutely. And so another great conversation with him. I feel like we covered a lot. This DNA, this document that he forwarded us right before the interview started was a little eye-opening to see.
I mean, my God.
I mean, it's dated 1996, December 30th, 1996 is when I think it was submitted. Yeah, and that date's here. It's interesting to see. And, I definitely need a little help reading it because there's a lot of letters, and I'm not used to reading things like this.
Right.
But, yeah.
Yeah.
But it essentially seems to clear the Ramseys and, of that unknown DNA.
Yeah.
So, whether you think that that's the killer's DNA, I mean, if you do, then I guess you're off of the family, right? If you don't, then I don't know. I don't know what to say. But it seems like that's the killer's DNA.
Yeah. As he forwarded this, I kind of gave a chuckle because, I'd been watching the documentary, the docuseries, refreshing my, information on him and Lou Smit. And then he's like, oh, I forgot if I did this. And he sends it, and it's like an hour before, and it's legit, like Colorado Bureau of Investigation's laboratory report. It lists suspects, Patsy Ramsey, John Ramsey. It goes through the exhibits with the, exhibit number 5, number 7, number 14, blood stains from the shirt, from this, from that, saliva. And it took me like a good 45 minutes. Like you said, I don't know how to read this. Like, it took me like 45 minutes just to wrap my head around it. And I'm wondering, like, is there anybody in this, like, in within 50 miles of me right now that has the Colorado Bureau of Investigation lab report on JonBenét Ramsey open on their computer right now? Like, just the wildness of that moment is incredible to me. But I'm glad that he cleared up a couple of things that were confusing to me. And one of the things was, when this was submitted, did they then list John and Patsy as suspects based on the report, or were they suspects before? And he answered that clearly and said, well, no, because this was December when they were suspects immediately, but the report completed on January 15th of 1997, so less than a month later. And it goes through and explains that they are excluded with other family members and other individuals. And then I was confused about DNA that was consistent with John and Patricia. And he explained, like, well, that was just from something that was in the home. So you can't make a conclusion on something that wasn't part of, like, the crime scene. So that cleared it up. But like you were saying in the intro, like, this murder has taken on a life of its own because of information like this that's not properly explained. And sometimes people don't want to hear the explanation because it goes against their theory. But I hope there are more people out there that appreciate the correction of information and take that into consideration when they're formulating their theory.
Right. And yeah, I have to wonder what is going on exactly in this case. If there's, obviously there's confirmation bias out there. I think you could argue whatever side of this case you want, there's confirmation bias, whatever side of the coin or the fence you fall on it. But it's strange to me that most people who heard about this case years ago, maybe they looked into it, maybe they didn't, but they still think the family had something to do with it, and it takes work to extract that thought from people. And I never really looked into the case, so I have to wonder if that's why I was willing to accept the intruder theory more willingly than folks who had been convinced that the Ramseys had something to do with it. I don't know if that's the case or not, but what do you think?
I think it's some of that, but it's also, you and I have talked to so many people who have been part of an investigation or family members of people who were abused and murdered or suspected of being murdered by their abuser, parents who are abusive to their children, their small children, and ended up murdering them. And all of those situations have a certain common denominator of the type of person that does something like this. And I'm not going to generalize, but I'll just say there's always something that can connect the type of people that do these things. And when you're looking at Burke Ramsey, he doesn't have that common denominator as a 9-year-old boy. He's never been violent before. He was never violent after. And the same thing for the family. Same thing for Patsy and for John. So I think like part of our confirmation bias is that there's no flags on the family, and everything is flagged towards an intruder.
Yeah, I think some people will point to, it was Patsy's paintbrush. And JonBenét had a bedwetting problem. That is pretty normal for a 6-year-old kid. And the paintbrush was with her paint supplies in the basement. When it seems like, to me anyway, that the intruder decided to fashion a weapon, or in his sick head, needed to fashion a weapon at that moment. And that's what he used. It is really wild to me to think of any outcome in this case. Absolutely anything, right? If there's a home invasion, there's some secret intruder who entered the house, maybe knowing that they weren't going to be there, and waited around for hours, walked around, looked at John Ramsey's office and found that $118,000 paperwork that said that was his bonus, wrote a few tries of the ransom letter, finally wrote one that they wanted to leave, and then they came home. The Ramseys came home and then did all this, right? So I know that is hard to believe, and it is. That is wild to think that, someone that bonkers isn't going to be patient enough to wait. It's like, I don't know. It's, as we sort of talked about, it's really hard to put yourself in the head of someone who might do this. But what is equally as crazy, Lance, is the opposite, right? If we're saying Patsy Ramsey had something to do with this, or it was an accidental fall and her and John, they covered it up. Okay, well then why did they sexually assault her with a paintbrush? Like, are we saying to stage the scene? I'm sorry. There's no way. I find that more unbelievable than I find some sexual predator sneaking into a house, looking after, trying to abduct a beauty pageant queen.
Yeah. I think that also goes towards the topic that John was really intent on getting our opinion on, which was it responsible for the docuseries to include the picture of the skull and the damage that the skull had on it? And I think that what you just said, I think speaks to it, is like, no one falls that hard. No one falls that hard, like accidentally from a small distance. That's somebody who was hit with something like a baseball bat. It's not. If you're trying to make that into something where, she fell, like I think John said it, that she fell and hit her head on the tub. Like, that's not a tub. It's not.
Yeah.
That's not slipping in the tub from a distance of 3.5 feet.
No, I think it was the injury was consistent with like a fall of I want to say 3 stories or something in that range.
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly. So if you're trying to come up with like, well, the damage was due to an accidental fall and then they had to stage it, if she had accidentally fallen and bumped her head and maybe lost consciousness, their next reaction is let's murder her and sexually assault her with a paintbrush and stage this whole thing instead of just taking her to the hospital. Even if they were tussling,
She might have been fine. She might have been okay.
she might have been
depending
okay.
on what
Yeah,
happened.
probably concussion. If you fall and hit your head in the bathtub, like a concussion, reasonable. But like even if they'd been pulling at each other in the middle of a fight, there's nothing to suggest that like they wouldn't look at her after she fell and not take her to the hospital.
And the craziest part about this is if we're talking about Patsy Ramsey, she had stage 4 cancer that she beat before JonBenét was murdered. So
Right.
she
Good point.
She stared death in the face. And then after beating cancer, a terminal illness, she's going to murder her daughter because she wet the bed?
Right. Little things like that just get to her now.
I mean, if anything, it would be the opposite way. Life would be even more precious, I would imagine.
Yep, you let those little things go. You say, well, she's 6 years old. She's kind of common that she's going to wet the bed. You know, in the early interviews that we did with John Anderson, I really liked how he showed the book cover again, how he showed JonBenét not as a beauty queen.
Right.
And
he
and
mentions that, yeah.
Yeah, explain to us how Patsy wasn't that obsessive beauty queen driven must win at all costs mom. It was just it was a part of their life, like a part of hundreds of other little girls' lives whose parents put them in these pageants. There was nothing stand out about that, but the media got that whole image down and she became this like mommy dearest character. And you're
Right.
so right. Like no one mentions that she beat stage 4 cancer beforehand, how that might change someone's perspective. And usually you don't turn into a complete maniac, a sexual fiend. You usually don't, a sexual murdering fiend.
Yeah, I also think like some of the still images of Patsy probably didn't do her any favors. She does have those pale blue eyes, and oftentimes she was like emphatic in the way she was speaking. So still imagery doesn't really work that well in that scenario because she kind of looks a little off, you know. But in fairness, she is a little off. Her daughter was just murdered, and there's also a part in the docuseries where I think they suggest she may have been on some kind of medication or something, and she's given a press conference. She's kind of slurring her words. And again, it's like, man, I don't know how hard that would be to do. I cannot hold any blame on her for if she took some pills to make it easier on herself.
Yeah, I mean, pardon her for taking some medication to bring her anxiety down and maybe getting a little upset during interviews or getting upset with photographers or the media. Pardon her. I mean, her daughter was just brutally sexually assaulted and murdered in her own home, found by her husband during the holidays. Oh, look, she's got a wild look in her eyes. Yeah.
Yeah, there's another thing I did want to mention. Lance, this is something that you had mentioned when we interviewed John before. The word panties comes up a few times, and it's in this DNA report too. And I know it is disturbing to you, and it is to me as well when we're talking about a 6-year-old girl. But I think the reason it's used is because she also had on like some long underwear or a nightgown. So I think they're trying to differentiate when, at least in John's case, when he uses that term.
Yeah. And I mean, it's a different time when they wrote this. I was really surprised. This report was written in 1996, so it kind of puts things into perspective that the word panties is used in connection with a 6-year-old, because that's not the connection that we make nowadays. But
yeah.
I think you're right. I think they were trying to just make the separation between the long underwear and her regular underwear. But it is a much larger conversation. You had texted me as well how some people would say that would use the word sexy when describing her at the beauty pageants. Like, that's way different.
I would love to bring this up because, yeah, in the docuseries, there is a section where it kind of talks about JonBenét and, like, you know, maybe she was seen by just a larger amount of people because she was in those beauty pageants, and it goes through sort of, you know, some of the video and things like that. I thought she looked adorable as like a little kid, you know, but it would cut away to interviews and they would like, well, she's dressed all sexy. What do you expect? It's like, no, she's not dressed sexy. She's dressed like a little kid with makeup on. Like, she's wearing a dress, yeah, but she's not sexy. She's not really doing anything sexy. She's being a little kid. She has makeup on. And yes, the whole pageant thing, you know, I guess I have some opinions probably on that. Not really that strong ones, but, you know, it's not something that I've entered my kids in, put it that way. I'll stop there. You know, but and when they wear makeup, I don't love it now. They're young, you know, but it's a part of life, and that's that culture. That's that beauty queen culture or beauty pageant culture.
Yeah. I mean, if the word sexy is coming into your mind as you're describing how she was dressed and how she looked during these pageants, then take a little bit of a deeper look at yourself. Because, I mean, I could understand someone saying they're trying to dress her up to look sexy. Yeah. That's different than saying, well, she's dressed all sexy.
Well, in fairness, that might have been how it came out in the docuseries. But I still think that's kind of wrong because they're not actually. They're not dressing her up sexy. They're dressing her up like a little kid with a dress on and makeup.
Yeah, exactly. It's a really tough point to argue for.
Yeah.
Just say pretty.
Yeah.
Just say pretty, or like they're trying to make her look like an adult. Like, it's just
right.
It's weird. It's a weird word to use.
It is a weird word to use. Yeah, but I think that's what they meant for the most part. But yeah, I did just want to mention it here because it was something that bothered me as well. And you know, it's pretty obvious if you've had that thought and you watch the docuseries at that section. You know.
Yeah. Well, maybe we'll do some more during a subscription show.
Yeah, I would love to. And I'm sure there'll be a lot of comments on this episode, and we welcome them all. Hope there's no one offended by our comments here today. We definitely have the same thoughts in this case. And, you know, so sometimes there's not that back and forth, but, you know, that's what the commenters are for. So we do appreciate all the comments, even the dissenting ones. Please. Send us your questions. Maybe we will be able to have John Anderson back on to address some of those questions, or maybe even a live show at some point with John Anderson. I think that would be a really great, might have a great turnout.
Yeah, absolutely. And if you're taking some time to leave comments, we mentioned at the beginning of the show that they have a GoFundMe that helps fund this investigation. Even if you're leaving dissenting comments, just, you know, as long as you're online, swing over to GoFundMe and just search the JonBenét Ramsey, Lou Smit GoFundMe. Give $5. Even if you disagree, just give $5. Maybe they'll uncover some piece of truth that was part of your theory. So you'd help with that.
Thanks a lot for listening, everybody. We really appreciate it. Please follow us on social media at MissingCSM and get John Wesley Anderson's book after you watch the Netflix documentary Cold Case: Who Killed JonBenét Ramsey.